Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 20th of October, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we will be joined by a live video Skype link by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Well, just a brief comment. It's clearly autumn. We've got some delightful colours on the trees around us here in Plymouth. So that's a real boost to see something wonderful, really. Sun is shining. It seems to be across much of UK, but dear old London is under a little bit of a chilly cloud at the moment. Could that be the onset of war, Mike?
Well, we'll find out later on. We're going to start off with Mr. Fogh Rasmussen. And we mentioned this, I think, last week or the week before, the last time you were on, Mark. You had mentioned that you were going to be going to see him speak at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. What did he have to say for himself then?
Quite a lot, Brian and Mike. They welcomed him Tuesday, October 18th. I was there with about 75 people, mostly the upper echelon of Chicago society, some of the you might say normal people, no media visible, and that's always the thing at these CCGA, Chicago Council on Global Affairs meetings. This is of course the American version of your Chatham House, your Royal Institute of International Affairs. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former head of NATO, he was the chief of NATO from 2009 to 2014, a former Danish prime minister and a one-time economics apparatchik, had some very considerable things to say. The main thing is that this CCGA clique is very worried about the rise of populism and the fact that people are beginning to think in nationalist, isolationist terms again. Ergo, his speech was to reinforce the globalist view that we have to have an internationalist system and that the U.S. has to lead and continue to be the global cop, the top police force of the world. And he spoke very strongly to reinforce that whole idea. And one of his key quotes was, he's speaking to the American people, whether you like it or not, you're destined to lead. Let me say that again, whether you like it or not, you're destined to lead. And so there it is, the U.S. must lead and bleed the New World Order militarily, patrol the world in ad infinitum, forever, basically, in a permanent fashion. And he's trying to fasten this onto the psyche of anybody that would think otherwise. He speaks in a very dictatorial fashion, a very autocratic kind of way, even though he condemns so-called autocrats like Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. But another thing was that he spoke very lovingly of Harry Truman, his favorite president. Rasmussen professes to be a lover of America. Harry Truman was one of his heroes, and ergo, the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944, when they created the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, this is the international system. This is the sacred cow, what he calls, let me get this right, I wrote this down, the rules-based liberal democratic world order, the rules-based liberal democratic world order. And that is this alphabet soup of free trade deals and the World Trade Organization and this whole economic infrastructure. And that is what the U.S. is supposed to patrol the world to protect. So it's funny, I don't remember any U.S. official or soldier taking an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and protect Bretton Woods. And yet this is what Rasmussen was saying. That economic, social, capitalist, monopoly capitalist order is why we fight. That's why the U.S., whether we like it or not, must patrol the world in a permanent fashion. And this is the core of what he had to say on Tuesday.
So is it unfair to paraphrase him as saying that the United States must be the policeman or the enforcer of the empire?
Oh, absolutely. A U.S.-led world imperium, and the U.S. must keep that role. We mustn't backslide into any form of nationalistic or populism of any kind. And interestingly enough, this coming Monday, I'll be covering another CCGA program where they're having a half-day symposium Monday, October 24th, to study populism. What is it? What is its impact on this exact world structure that I'm describing now? They're very concerned about populist ideas and personalities and political parties and factions rising up out of this economic and military order that they're trying to put the final attachments to, the final nails in the coffin of freedom. And this is a very pivotal time, really beyond Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that has its place. But this is really the issues. This is really the kind of people like Rasmussen, people like the head of Chatham House, Robin Niblett, who will be at the Populism program on Monday in Chicago. These are the real movers and shakers. These are the real agenda setters. The politicians are really just their appendages. And so that's why I follow these committees of Bilderberg, you might say, and this is what they're up to.
He's obviously worried about this rise of populism, this rise of nationalism, this anti-globalist feeling around the world. That if I'm reading you right, what you seem to be suggesting is they have no idea how this has come about, and they actually don't know how they might counteract it. They clearly want to counteract it. They're clearly concerned about it. Do you think they have the capacity to understand it?
I don't know. They live in such a rarefied world, many of these global double domes, as I sometimes call them. They're so obsessed with their own wealth and prestige and position and careerism. I don't know that they can descend the fathoms of depth down to the level of the common man and even understand the common man in a way where they could counter this. The main thing they rely on is the mainstream media, which won't cover these kind of events. In fact, the Chicago Tribune is in bed with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. They're an ally of them, not an objective observer like myself and maybe a couple of bloggers that might have been in the audience at Rasmussen's speech. So they depend a lot on the media to keep singing this siren song of, the U.S. must lead this imperium. We must protect what grew out of Bretton Woods. And we can't have any notions of backsliding. As soon as the U.S. Takes a step back, Rasmussen said, in come the bad guys, ISIS and Vladimir Putin. Wherever the U.S. steps back, there's a vacuum created, and these are the kind of distasteful personalities and autocrats that fill the void. It's a constant peddling of fear under the guise of the U.S. and the West being the arbiters of freedom and justice and democracy.
Yeah.
But in fact, that's largely not true. And I'm not saying Russia is a bastion of freedom. A lot of people get us confused when we say these things. We're being objective here. We're not going to just because we live in the West, we're not just going to call them angels either. We're trying to sort this out objectively.
Yeah. Mark, often people say to us, give us some good news amongst all the things that you report. Tell us something that's good. And really, there's a lot of good buried in what you've just said. This comments that these people, immensely powerful people working at the highest levels of the US, of government systems across the world, access to immense media and money, and they are struggling at the moment because despite all their best efforts, they're not managing to suppress very ordinary people who are starting to wake up to what's going on, and they're using their own means to get this information out. So by this panic almost in these people, we're actually seeing that the simple pushing out of the truth, exposing what these people are doing, is very damaging to them, and in turn, they don't know how to deal with it.
That's a good point, Brian. That's exactly right. When they appear rankled in a genuine way, you know that somebody's pushing the right buttons in the alternative media, in some of the alternative parties, and just everyday people. Brexit, at the very least, is a sign that they don't like. It may not have much substance. It may not succeed like we've reported here, but the basic signal that it sends, they don't like. And they marry that with Donald Trump. They don't like what he stands for, although Trump could be a Trump card and kind of a spoiler and not necessarily be for real in the way people hope. But giving him the benefit of the doubt for now, they don't like what that signifies. There's offhand remarks made at these CCGA meetings about Trump, little snickers and little laughs under people's breath. But the general populist movement, grassroots democracy for real, does frighten them. And you're right, it's a good sign because they're having to reshuffle the deck and they're having to protect the system at all costs. So therefore, they praise the system. Bretton Woods, oh, this wonderful trade, the democratic rules-based order. Rules written up by whom? Rules for the benefit of whom? Let's be honest here.
Saul Alinsky rules is what we're talking about. The locking together of these historical facts, the role of Saul Alinsky in Chicago, the fact that we've had the now chief executive of Common Purpose, Julia Middleton. Where does she say she started her route to spreading future leaders in Britain? That all started with her work in America. Then she's alongside Demos. We follow the trail of Saul Alinsky, and I think we're well on the way to this new radical agenda.
Indeed. And just to summarize this issue, the Rasmussen also noted, and this is a new item as far as I know, that, quote, in my opinion, we should strive for TAFTA, a transatlantic free trade area. And what that is a general outline into which free trade deals would be built.
This is Mark, this is exactly what Theresa May is talking about. Of course, since TTIP is such a tainted brand, in the transatlantic sphere at least, they're looking for a new brand for it. But Theresa May really wanting to roll that free trade model out across the world.
Isn't it interesting how in concert these people are? I didn't know Theresa May said that, and yet look at how these things fit together. You and I don't talk about these things ahead of time before we go on the show, and yet everything fits together like a puzzle. That indicates that we're being accurate here.
Yeah.
And so yeah, this it was kind of insinuated by Rasmussen that the TTIP is kind of teetering. I call it the teetering TTIP. And so they're kind of reinventing this thing, the TAFTA, the transatlantic free trade area. In another realm, there used to be the free trade area of the Americas. This is the general infrastructure into which, again, these free trade deals fit. Enough said about that, but that was a brand new thing, as Rasmussen declared, quote, I'm a 100% free trader.
Yep.
And he was really, really proud of that. So.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, we have here the will to lead America's indispensable role in the global fight for freedom. Anybody wants to watch Rasmussen's speech? That's the title of it on the Chicago Council of Global Affairs website. Right, Mark. Let's move on to Truthhound, your own blog. And well, is the U.S. election going to be rigged? And just as I don't want you to spend too much time on this, but just as a sort of throwaway comment, what did you make of the clown show last night?
To be honest, I didn't see it all. I was on a train from Chicago into Michigan. However, I managed on the train internet to get this blog posting up by a columnist I know, David Swanson. He writes some very penetrating and comprehensive things. Enough said, if I just comment that this article at thetruthhound.com, that's thetruthhound.com, my blog, explains very clearly, and the best I've seen, exactly how the system is rigged. And that includes polls, that includes media bias. It definitely includes the hackable computerized voting machines that can secretly flip votes with their secretive proprietary software. But if you read the article on thetruthhound.com by David Swanson, you'll see when Donald Trump says the system is rigged, he's correct. And this article explains the many ways, the myriad ways that it is. But of course, the electronic voting machines are the key And we can talk about that another time with a connection of mine named Jim Condit Jr., who's the expert on that. And maybe we'll have him on the show and he can really explain the electronic voting machine angle.
Okay, and this one then, after the bombing of a GOP office, locals worry that the presidential race is fueling hate.
Yeah, I just wanted this item on the show today in passing because this, tying into what I just said, this shows again the weaponized media. The title of a book I'm working on, the weaponized media skewing things. The real problem is the media creating an atmosphere of hate, and the constant ragging about Donald Trump saying the system is rigged. Donald Trump is a xenophobe. Donald Trump is a misogynist. He hates women. He hates minorities. He hates crippled people. And they keep stirring the pot, the racial pot. And the media creates this atmosphere of hate. And then you end up with somebody throwing a flammable substance through a window here of a Republican office in North Carolina, reacting to this media-fed hate, which, of course, tends to affect those people that have weaker constitutions and are more prone to violence. But this is what we have. And I believe that's Vice Presidential nominee Mike Pence looking through some of the burned wreckage. And this is just a sample of what this media-inspired atmosphere of hate can create. And I think it was just worth noting so this item doesn't get buried by all the hoopla in the wake of last night's debates between Clinton and Trump. So this is just an example of what we're getting here.
Well, of course, that's not the only example of it, because you've got all the black-white hate being pumped up by the media in the United States at the moment. And in this country, we're getting the Brexit-related hate being pumped up. And we've had so many stories in the media the last few days about immigration. Again, immigration was a big issue over the entire Brexit referendum run-up. But here we've got everything being blamed on Brexit this time. The House of Lords has to be gotten rid of. We've got to have wholesale constitutional reform because the House of Lords is going to derail Brexit. What's this actually about? This is increasingly inflammatory headlines from the Express, amongst others. But this is about, well, the article says peers have infuriated Brexit supporters by demanding a parliamentary vote before Britain formally applies to quit the European Union. Well, first of all, the implication is that it was the entire House of Lords, that they'd taken some kind of vote across all 850 of them. And in fact, that was nothing of the kind. It was simply a report from the House of Lords EU Committee, which is 18 members of the House, and they had suggested that there should be a vote in Parliament on Brexit. Now, of course, actually, if there was an effective UKIP, if there was an effective anti-EU campaign or an effective or even an effective public that were actually engaged with their MPs, we wouldn't have to fear a vote in Parliament on this issue, because MPs would understand how we all feel about it, and we'd probably find that the result would replicate the referendum, actually. So there's a number of issues here. One is the suggestion that we throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of the House of Lords, because 18 of them has called for a vote in Parliament over this. But the other issue is just taking a step back and asking ourselves the question about a vote in Parliament and the risks of that, and what our role is in making sure that, should there be such a vote, that the right result comes about.
The Brexit vote has caused huge problems, Mike. Of course, you led the statement that the whole thing was going to be pure theatre anyway, but nevertheless, that vote was carried through. It's causing panic. So if we take from Brexit, and let's go into Britain's military, bring in the BBC, because this is just an astonishing article by the BBC. Russia's naval task force, this is the Russian task force around a small carrier that's been coming down, it's come down the Norwegian Sea and the North Sea, and to go through the Channel, through into the Mediterranean and to stand off Syria. But Russia's naval task force, power play or just theatre? Well, they're very big on putting up the ships. And if we take a little look at what's being said, why is Russia enhancing its naval presence of Syria now? The answer is part capability and part theatre. So those naughty Russians, they're into pure theatre, nothing that the West gets up to, David Cameron or Theresa May. This is just theatre and posturing. So there we are. Russia's naval activity is a display, a demonstration of Moscow's capability, and it retains ambitions to play an overseas role. From what you've said, Mark, Russia's not allowed to play because it's not part of this new world rule-based governance system. So naughty Russia, you're not going to be allowed to play. And here we go. Tensions with the West are high. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the Syria crisis have failed. There's been talk in Washington about exploring potential military options. Well, too right there has, because we've even got as far as Hillary Clinton saying we should more or less press the nuclear button and solve the problem. Russian reinforcements help to consolidate its position and make West's military action probably unthinkable. Now, I just want to highlight here that the photos are attributable to the Norwegian armed forces. And I regard this as very significant, and we'll show you why in just a minute. But let's focus on the author of this report. Here he is, Jonathan Marcus. We're saying it's propaganda. So he's pointing a finger at the Kuznetsov. He says it's a 26-year-old ship. It rarely goes anywhere without a naval tug, just in case it breaks down. So a total smear against the Russian military capability. So we thought we'd just point out to him, but Britain's latest Type 45 warships can't actually go to sea due to engine defects in warm water. Yeah. But he doesn't mention those at all. He then says this: it'll also be the first combat test for Russia's MiG-29 warplanes. Russian carrier-borne aircraft are launched not by catapult as in the US Navy, but with a sort of ski ramp. So he's taking the mickey out of the Russians. Well, let's have a look at this. We've got the F-35, which is not even at sea with the Royal Navy, suffering engine fires. I believe it did manage to fire its gun a couple of months ago, but engine fires and they're melting, apparently.
Yeah, but it didn't fire its gun while it was in the air, so no, it didn't do the two things at the same time.
It was on the ground. So let's highlight this little dig with a sort of ski ramp. Well, where did the ski ramp came from? It came from the Royal Navy. And here's Britain's latest aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, with the ski ramp, but our aircraft carrier's not at sea. This is treason by our politicians and senior members of Britain's armed forces, because the public is not being given the full picture. And then it says these are rare outings for Russia's big ships. Indeed, this will be the aircraft carrier's first ever combat deployment. So probably the Russians should have brought the ship out before, because according to Jonathan Marcus, we need a bit more violence in the world.
But hold on, if this is its first ever combat deployment, does that not give us a clue about Russia's intent?
Absolutely. Well, this man is a joker. Have a look at him on LinkedIn. Have a look at his Twitter page, a joker. But I've added at the bottom that, of course, Britain's aircraft carriers, the two new aircraft carriers, are not even operational, and they were covered in scaffolding till 2016. But the BBC thinks that it would be a good thing to snigger at the Russians. So let's look at this. There's a better picture of the ramp. It's our ramp. In fact, the Russians took over the idea, and the Americans were originally using steam catapults, which was a British idea in the first place. Sorry about this blatant pro-British propaganda, Mark, but we just got to get the point home. And what did David Cameron do with Britain's aircraft carriers? He scrapped them. So David Cameron knew apparently what was coming, but he scrapped British aircraft carriers. He also scrapped the Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft. These are the aircraft that would have been tracking that Russian fleet. They would have been taking the pictures, they would have been monitoring all the communications and the electronic transmissions. We don't have any of these aircraft, and that is why the pictures have come from the Norwegians, because they do. And then what did Cameron also scrap? He scrapped all of the Harriers. This was our operational carrier fleet. 72 Harriers scrapped. Well, they were sold to the Americans, and here they are operational in the desert. But they were sold for the price of one F-35, Mike. Yeah. So this is treason by the British government. And why? Well, it's been David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives who's been putting this together. This is why, because if we go to the Royal Navy's very own web page, what does it talk about? It says that Royal Navy sailors have had to go on board the American aircraft, the USS Harry S. Truman, to be trained. We can't train our own guys because we don't have the equipment at sea. And they've had to go, surprise, surprise, to the French aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle, an aircraft carrier which has a reputation for barely being able to steam 2 meters without breaking down. They are supposedly training Britain's carrier crews. So this is malfeasance in public office. We've got mod media lying to the British public. We've got senior retired officers from the Royal Navy and the other services refusing to tell the British public the truth. We're into dangerous waters. And I'll just finish it off very quickly before we hand back to Mike and Mark. This is an article from the Mirror. A third of British sailors want to jump ship. And the whole article is about plummeting morale. It's talking about the carriers being sold off. And if we just highlight a bit here, there it is. The carriers went out of service. We're promised these carriers are coming in. But this is the statement. The Royal Navy is perilously close to its critical mass in terms of manpower. And that was General Sir Nicholas Horton in 2013. Where are we in 2016? Well, let's have a look. The Royal Navy has a 35% shortage of trained engineers, leaving ships unable to deploy at sea. The submarine fleet is crippled with engineer and highly specialised crew shortages. And the Royal Navy's personnel liaison team has been desperately struggling to retain manpower, with between 7 and 35% manning shortages across the Navy, plummeting morale as undermanned ships struggle to cope with an average of 8% shortages. And the RN is desperately offering cash bonuses for men to stay in service or to transfer to even more critically short specialisations. So they're paying out lump sums from 5,000 to 17,000. And we understand that some personnel, I believe associated with the submarine service, have had £35,000 one-off payments to get them to stay in. And of course, what is buying loyalty doing? It's further damaging morale so that ultimately even more people are leaving. But the BBC doesn't want to report this. The BBC simply wants to say, well, let's point a stick and have a bit of fun at the Russians because they've decided to deploy.
Well, it wasn't just the BBC, and I've just found this headline absolutely the most offensive of any of them. This is war in capitals, according to the Express. Putin sends largest fleet of Russian ships since Cold War to Syria. And the implication of this and a whole bunch of other mainstream coverage of this, they were really pretty apoplectic about it, is that somehow Britain being in the way, as it were, and Russia having to sail around us, so this is somehow a threat to us. And of course, they reinforce this notion that Russia is there to carry out the war, continue the war in Syria, and that it's a humanitarian disaster. Well, let's just remember that there's currently a ceasefire in Aleppo, and the Russians have set up 4 live webcams on the humanitarian corridors. They're continuing this cessation in the bombings in Aleppo while they allow as many people as possible to get out of that area through the corridors. There are live webcams to watch that happening. But we mentioned a couple of days ago the fact that these corridors were being set up. We mentioned the fact that rebels, shall we call them in inverted commas, were being allowed to leave with a rifle in hand, with their families in tow. They're being allowed to leave. They're being taken to Idlib when they do leave, and that any that remain might be at risk. Well, in fact, Reuters today has mentioned that a NATO diplomat who refuses to be named has said exactly the same thing, that this Russian naval deployment, which is on its way to Syria, is there because the aircraft carriers carrying fighter bombers. It's there to, well, we suggested yesterday that eastern Aleppo would end up being flattened. That's probably what's going to happen. But the bottom line here is this is not a direct threat to Britain, despite what the Express and others imply. Inflammatory headlines such as "This is war" it's just ridiculous.
Well, some people have commented that if you actually look at the fear that it induces into the public in UK, it's a terrorist act by the newspaper itself,
Yes.
which is an interesting point of view.
Right, we'll just mention this before we speak to Mark again. Of course, over the last couple of weeks, Boris Johnson has been, well, he was speaking at in the House of Commons. If we can just put this one up, please, Theo. He was speaking in the House of Commons, and he was also speaking to the Select Committee the following day during the emergency debate. He was saying we will be, and then this was for the European EU foreign ministers meeting. He was saying we will be discussing how to keep this pressure up on the Assad regime and on its puppeteers in the form of the Russian government. So we've got to get that dig in. Fortunately, he was not able to get any support for any major action against Russia. But of course, in the next sentence, and he mentioned this in Parliament as well. And of course, let's not forget the Iranians. So we've got to draw the Iranians into this somehow. Well, this isn't related to Syria as such, but the Iranians being drawn into the Yemeni conflict. And of course, we had this false flag, as it appears, incident last week, where the United States claimed that the Houthis had been firing missiles at their warships and that they had fired back. Now they are alleging that, in fact, Iran was involved in that, and the Iranians have been forced to deny that. So they have denied that. They've said it's false and paranoid. The vague and contradictory remarks by American officials these past days are false, paranoid, and inappropriate. That was the Foreign Ministry spokesman. So the pressure is starting to build on Iran as well. And Mark, the games that are being played around the Middle East at the moment and Russia, unbelievably dangerous. And if Hillary wins the presidency, that's only going to get worse.
Indeed, Mike. Hillary is a neoconservative in Democratic garb, like I've said. She's actually in tune with the Republican faction that wants not only the U.S. to be the global cop, like Rasmussen argued, but that believes that war is always the answer, that you export democracy with a bayonet through the end of a gun. And I just wanted to mention that today at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, your British General, Richard Shirreff, is speaking to that august body, and his topic is literally the road to war, Russia, NATO, and the threat of inaction. Note those words, the threat of inaction. So you have this British military and Navy ill prepared, as Brian very ably outlined, and yet you have British officials saying the threat of inaction. This is the road to war with Russia via NATO. So this is another indication why the U.S. must lead the world imperium, because apparently the U.S. must keep up their Navy a little better, the ships and the equipment and whatnot. The British military has been compromised probably so it can be absorbed into the EU army. And this is the picture we're seeing. Everything fits into place.
You got to keep dying on our behalf.
Well, that was the point I was going to make. If you watch what happens on the world stage, British politicians stand up, they start the rhetoric, and in the case of wherever it's going to be, Iraq or Libya or Syria, it's British politicians that start the warmongering. David Cameron, classic example, Tony Blair. But who takes the real casualties? Of course, the real casualties are always the American services, and I see exactly the same thing. So we've got this British general presiding. I haven't even got going on the state of the British Army at the moment, a disaster area, no disrespect to the men and women serving, but this is the outrageous duplicity of senior British officers who are carrying on as if we have major armed forces capable of engaging in major action overseas. This is not the case. And so he gives this warmongering talk. Who is going to pay the price with a body count? That's going to be American armed forces. So I find these people despicable, and we are clearly seeing British senior officers in the military living in their own reality. They're into leadership, they're into transformation. Why is he giving this talk? On what basis? Is it part of his terms of reference to get involved in this political way? I think this is outrageous and very dangerous stuff.
He's promoting a book, Richard Sheriff, at the Chicago program today under this provocative title that I just mentioned. To give a little humorous frosting to the cake we're describing here, the F-35 that you mentioned that overheats and barely works is a U.S.-made plane. Many of those are being shipped to Israel with the record $38 billion that the U.S. approved well into the future for Israel. But it's almost like this Samsung phone thing where the Samsung phones just kind of blow up in your pocket or melt. The F-35 is much like the Samsung phone problem. That's kind of a humorous little takeaway here. And that's one problem that the U.S. shares with the U.K. is the F-35. So the U.S. military apparatus and the equipment is far from perfect, but we have to maintain it in a very broad and ongoing way to lead this imperium. As Rasmussen warned us, we must never give that up. So it's kind of humorous, though. It's the F-35 being much like the Samsung phone. So
okay,
here we go.
Mark, thank you very much for that. Humor is always good. A little bit of an eye on the clock, but I'll just add with a little bit of something sour under your icing that we've just discovered that the senior British officer who would have been one of the key decision makers, even by saying nothing, which allowed the Harrier to be sold off, just now happens to be working for Lockheed Martin. But no conflict of interest there at all, Mike.
Not at all.
What are we going to do about this? Well, it's educating people, helping them to understand what's going on. So we're saying if you've never been to a British Constitution Group event before, the event on the 19th of November this year, reasserting the rule of law, is going to be major.
Yeah, that's the point, reasserting the rule of law, not reasserting the rules-based economic whatever they want to call it.
Indeed. And we're starting to focus on our speakers. Vanessa Beeley here, what a lady. Has been into Syria at great risk to herself in order to get the truth out about what's going on. So this is no nonsense from the BBC. These are people who are talking about what's really happening on the ground in Syria. And of course, that is a conflict stirred up by a British government which is out of control. Guy Taylor, well known to many people, but Guy has been battling the corruption in Britain's courts. And he's been exposing the fact that Britain's secret courts can now steal children, businesses or property. And the agenda will be to say what we're going to do about this. More locally, we've got a meeting coming up on the 22nd, that's Saturday, I believe. And in the Royal Seven Stars Hotel in Totnes, there'll be a meeting talking about constitutional issues and the rule of law. So if you can attend one of those events, both of those events, please do. Key theme for the UK column is if you want to understand what's happening politically, you must understand that the establishment, the political elite, are involved in the abuse of children, and hence there must not be any proper protection for children. I'm going to ask for help with this article because it was sent through to us with a little comment. You need to research this. I've had a quick look at it, and what it seems to show is that child protection is to be privatised. And of course, once it is privatised, it means that the public has no way of questioning those companies who are supposedly going to protect children.
I suppose we should say for our listeners, the headline on that is New Law Will Let Councils Opt Out of Child Protection Rules.
Indeed, and that's an independent headline. Well, have a look at this. I've got to say, this really turns me sick to the bottom of my stomach. But as a result of pleas made by Cliff Richard, the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, Alistair Saunders, has decided to completely change the way the law works. So Cliff Richard has had a secret meeting with MPs and peers, private meeting in Parliament. Have you had a private meeting at all with any peers and MPs in Parliament, Mike?
No.
No. So the average person can't even get in to see their MP. Cliff Richard simply goes into Parliament and has a private meeting. Sorry, Theo, just pop that one back up. The key point here is that Alison Saunders is the very woman who has imprisoned a child abuse victim whose only crime has been to stand up and try to identify the people abusing children. Alison Saunders worked through the local North East Crown Prosecution Service to make sure that Melanie Shaw was locked up so that she couldn't tell the truth. She is still in prison. Meanwhile, a celebrity minces into Westminster and has a little private discussion, and Alison Saunders says, oh, well, we don't want to name anybody who's rich and famous. So here's the man, photograph taken, arriving at this secret meeting, big grin on his face, and this is the comment in the Mail article: only we who are innocent of any crime, but who are named publicly before any charge has been brought, before even being arrested or interviewed by police, will know the damage caused to our dignity, our standing, and our self-esteem. Now, I know many people will feel sickened by that comment, and I've already said that the fact he's able to have a meeting and change the way the Crown Prosecution Service works is outrageous. But let us remember, it was the BBC that effectively was tipped off about the operation from South Yorkshire Police. They then publicised the live raid on his home, and they were so confident about timing and duration, they were able to hire a helicopter to get the TV footage. So the BBC, if you follow it through, I don't know who that reporter is who was making the reports at the time. The BBC has ultimately carried out a ruse which has allowed the law to be changed to protect high-level people. This is outrageous. The BBC, my opinion, the most disgusting media outfit worldwide.
Yeah, I can't look at this as being anything other than an intentional undermining of the entire process.
Of child abuse investigations. Absolutely, indeed. Yes. Agree with you on that, Mike.
Okay, now yesterday we were talking about transformation of the police, and we had Brandon Lewis on saying, I believe there have been important steps in the right direction, but there's more to do, establishing the Police and Reform and Transformation Board and developing the reform vision for 2020 within policing, supported by the work of the College Policing. And we were highlighting the Transformation Fund, the Police Transformation Fund. And one of the things we mentioned was that changing demand was one of the drivers for this transformation. And of course, by changing demand, they were referring to the massive collapse in the quantities of crime in this country. So we've got to be really impressed by that. And they also said that the situation was so different to what it used to be that we've got to reimagine the whole system and not incrementally reform the system. But as I say, crime changing, because we've got collapsing crime on the streets and really digital crime is the really important thing now, but collapsing crime on the streets. So it was such a surprise to me that today, being slightly sarcastic, you understand, that the crime figures are out and violent crime levels 24% up. So what have we got here? Use of knives up by 9%, use of firearms up by 7%, 4.6 million offences in the year to June 2016. That's a rise of 7%. And police logged over 1 million offences of violence against the person, which is a 24% rise in the previous year. That's against 20,287 fewer police than there were in 2009, just before the current government got their first bite at the cherry, as it were. But don't worry, because we're transforming the police. It's not a problem. And Amber Rudd has announced another tranche of money. The job of the police must continue and forces must better reflect the communities they serve. This successful bid by Police Now, originally the idea of 2 serving officers, is an example of the transformative thinking we want for our police, from our police. So that's £5 million now going to Police Now. And what is Police Now? Well, we have a little video clip here. Video 1, please, Theo. And we'll watch this and then we'll discuss it in a second.
These streets where we live, these cobbles, these lines of turns and corners under our feet, they are ours to own. They are not home to fear, let's be clear. No place for hate, no home for crime. These are our streets where families and children thrive. Brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, not gangs and drugs on our street corners. The vicious circle can be broken, of sons like fathers and mothers daughters. These streets are our lives, our stories told. We make them what they are for the young and the old. The night is not our enemy, the turn of the day, a new time for excitement, a new place for play. Influence for generations in this moment now. Be in tune with society, in tune with these streets. Be proud of this work, be proud of our feats, of positive change and transformation. Be ready for tomorrow in these streets of our nation.
So Police Now, here's their website. They were set up in 2015, as Amber Rudd said, by two police personnel. And they are there it began as a pilot program, It has expanded from that. They are a network of regional headquarters across the UK. And what they're doing is recruiting graduates, special kinds of graduates, into the police, fast-tracking them in. As I say, £5 million from the Police Transformation Fund to do that. They are clearly absolutely front and centre with the whole idea of police transformation. But the police transformation that's going on is not terribly positive. I didn't get a pleasing feeling from that little video.
Well, it was very well shot, and as several people have commented, it was quite emotive. So you get this warm feeling, but of course this is all spin over the top that nobody's being told what's really going on. It's all about leadership and transformation into a future utopia where everything will be okay. It's not to do with the day-to-day reality. And I'll just add that over the last couple of weeks, we've had some really astonishing information coming into UK Column, talking about the fact that Essex Police do not seem to want to pick up weapons. So when weapons are being offered to Essex Police, and the police forces across the UK are saying if anybody knows of weapons, then we need to know because we want to take those weapons in. They're being offered weapons, but they don't want to pick them up.
So they want to keep them on the streets?
Well, it's deeper than that, because when I asked one of the individuals who is able to provide the information on that, why this would be, they said because if they accept the weapons, they have to accept the other circumstances around the weapons, which is major drug deals and child trafficking. So the police can't take the weapons, because if they take the weapons, all of the other dominoes start falling, and then it leads into massive drug deals and child trafficking with the police involved.
Is that the kind of transformation we're looking at then? More of that kind of thing?
Propaganda and lies over, don't worry what things are like today, we're going to be taken over the rainbow into the new future leader utopia. That's what transformation is. Mark.
That's the first I've seen that, of course. You know, I'm as warm and fuzzy as the next guy. I like children and happy days and good results. The question is how do you get to those good results? And that video, of course, is very unspoken. It doesn't even go there, how to achieve this so-called utopia. I won't attempt to sort this out, except to say that there's a big chasm between that end goal that video shows and actually how to get there realistically. And giving that kind of money to a nebulous outfit like Police Now doesn't seem like a wise expenditure of tax dollars at first blush as I see this.
It depends what you're hoping for at the end, of course. But what they're doing, as we said yesterday, is throwing away, a couple of hundred years of tradition that worked. And certainly one of the traditions that worked in the police was that you went in at the bottom and learned your trade. Yeah. And were recruited up through the ranks following a proper experience. but now they're taking in people direct from university that have no experience into the higher ranks, and they're fast tracking them through those ranks. What do you end up with at the end? A dysfunctional police service?
Yeah, and that's the pattern. At the weekend, Mark, you won't be aware of this, but at the weekend in Cornwall, there was a talk about what's happening in the NHS, and part of that talk was the fact that our national health system is absolutely falling apart. As it falls apart, what do we see? A massive increase in the injection of future leaders. We've got more and more NHS leaders, more and more talk about transformation, but as those words come into the vocabulary of NHS management, we're actually seeing the performance of the NHS decline. And this is a mirror image here in the police. It's also going on in Britain's armed forces. So this insidious change agenda, which I'm going to say we can track back to people such as Saul Alinsky, is being driven through the military, education, NHS here. And now we're starting to suffer as these institutions are clearly breaking down.
I'll just mention real quickly that there's a British comedy on Netflix, a movie, I think it's called Hot Fuzz, and it shows purportedly what the police culture is like in the UK. And the main hero of the movie, a well-known comic there, Simon Clegg or whatever his name is, maybe you guys know. If I'm getting his name right, if I butchered it, excuse me, but it shows him being the hero of the force. He's the very best. He saves children from fires. He arrests the criminals. He knows what to do. And he's basically sent out into a long, distant rural area. They actually want to get him out of the city where he's doing so much good because he's making the rest of the officers look bad. In other words, all the mediocrity in the police system, they don't want anybody being a good cop because it makes the rest of them look bad. So they send him out into some distant town and they try and get him out of there. And the culture seems to want to be mediocre. And I think that's true in the US police too. There's a lot of mediocrity. If somebody's a good cop, he tends to be actually marginalized. In other words, success is actually punished.
Yep.
Yeah. The good guys are punished, and the people who are inadequate or have their own political agenda are the ones that are moved up through the system.
Yeah.
Yeah, the mediocre ones are the ones promoted, and the good cops are the ones demoted.
Indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. It's always good to get this cross-Atlantic dialogue going because there's just a mirror image of so much that's happening in the political arena. And of course, it's ultimately going to be the US and UK leading the trouble in Syria. But we'll have more on that in due course. I would say to people who are watching the UK column, thank you very much for joining us. If you're a subscriber to us, thank you. If you're not, would you please consider taking out a subscription or making a donation? We can only function with your financial help. So if you can do that, it would be much appreciated. I'd also like to say thank you for the people that have made donations for the Doherty family. That has made a huge difference to Brian and Janice Doherty. But I'm also going to add, we still have no contact with that family, and we are starting to get extremely concerned that effectively Brian and Janice have disappeared in Ireland. That's where they were last located. But of course, they had been receiving death threats, and they had some very unpleasant incidents, both from people in authority, such as the police and the Garda, and other individuals that we believe would have the serious intent to do them harm. So if you are in contact with Brian and Janice, or you know something about their whereabouts, we would like to know so that we can assist their safety. That's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with David Scott and Northern Exposure. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.